I've been asked to say a few words about the infancy narratives. The infancy narratives are really unique in the scriptures. When we talk about the life of Jesus, it really begins with John the Baptizer. And before that, he's a carpenter working in Nazareth, and that's about it. But the apostles gathered around him and knew him beginning with John the Baptizer. The oldest gospel account is Mark, and he begins with John the Baptizer, nothing before that. The last one written is John, and he talks only about the pre-existence of Jesus, which is, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Matthew and Luke deal with the infancy, which takes place from the Annunciation of the birth of John the Baptizer up to the finding of the child Jesus in the temple. That's called the infancy narrative. And the interesting thing is, when you read through Matthew's account, it appears as though his information actually comes from Joseph. It's Joseph's view of Mary's pregnancy, for instance. But it appears to come from Joseph. That would be kind of natural, because that gospel account was written somewhere in Palestine, where people would have known Joseph and that sort of thing. Luke's account, on the other hand, is from the view of Mary. And in Luke's account, that's sort of natural too, because there's someone in the scriptures by the name of Luke who travels with Paul. And Paul spent a block of time in the city of Ephesus in modern-day Turkey. And we know that Mary lived in Ephesus with the Apostle John. After the ascension of Jesus, John the Apostle went to Ephesus in Turkey, became bishop there and taught, and Mary lived there with him until he died. So it would be very possible for the gentleman named Luke, who was traveling with Paul, to have actually interviewed Mary on these sort of things. And so we have the infancy narratives come entirely from Matthew and from Luke. I'm going to look a little bit at the beginning here of the infancy narratives. Actually begin with the account of the birth of John the Baptizer. John the Baptizer's parents were very holy people, and they were very faithful to the faith, but they had no children. And that was seen as a curse from God. At that time in history, they believed if you were a good person, everything went right in your life. If you were a bad person, you had problems. So problems indicated that they were not really good, and they lived under this shadow. Zachary was a priest, and because of the amount of priests at the time, so many of them would serve in the temple in different groups. And he was in the temple one time, and when his group, and he was to offer incense in front of the Ark of the Covenant. So he went in to offer the incense, and an angel appeared to him and announced that he actually would have a son. Zachary, because of his age as well as his wife's age, really didn't believe the angel. And so the angel struck Zachary mute. He could not speak. And so he went on home, and true to form, Elizabeth conceived and bore the child. And as soon as the child was named John, Zachary's voice returned. But what the story is, historically in the Bible, important people usually are born out of order to a family that wasn't having children. And that's a very consistent theme. It begins with Abraham and Sarah, but it's a consistent theme in the Bible. So it's a sign that John is this very important person. And John is then raised by his parents, and we're told that the Holy Spirit is upon him, and John is a powerful and holy man right from the beginning of his life. In fact, there's even the story in here that when the Virgin Mary visited Elizabeth, that John the Baptizer leapt in Elizabeth's womb in such a way that it indicated to Elizabeth that the Messiah was present. And in Bible terms, what you see there is John beginning his ministry. His ministry is always going to be to announce Jesus. So he begins his ministry even before his physical birth. He's been conceived, but he is not yet born. And he begins his ministry in the womb of Elizabeth. After the announcement of the birth of John, but before his birth actually, is the announcement to the Virgin Mary. John is exactly 6 months older than Jesus. So his announcement takes place. Then 6 months later, we have the Annunciation to the Virgin Mary. It's very common in the Roman Catholic Church, when you see paintings of the Annunciation, you see Mary oftentimes at a kneeler with an angel speaking to her, and this sort of thing. But the most ancient tradition is that Mary was actually at a well getting water. I think one of the reasons why we have in our background the tradition of Mary at a kneeler in a house is because the tradition of her being at prayer when she got the announcement is strong. But the building where the well is in Nazareth is a Greek Orthodox church. And so we centered more on the remains of the home where the Holy Family lived. So I think we see the Annunciation there. But the Annunciation actually took place at the well, and Mary was praying, probably. And the angel announced that she was to have the child, and Mary confronts the angel with the impossibility. And it's because she has had no sexual relations with anyone and appears sort of against having sexual relations, which indicates she might have made a vow or something about not having sexual relations with anyone. But whatever the reason, and the angel explains to her that basically nothing's impossible with God. And so she's open to having the child, and she says, "Be it unto me according to your word," because the angel was bringing the message of God. So she conceives the child at this time. One of the things about the praying, it was very, very common at the time for people to pray about the coming of the Messiah. The highest honor that any woman could have would be to be the mother of the Messiah. And that's why, like if you're familiar with the Quran and the Muslim community, the honor paid to Mary in the Muslim community is actually higher than it is in the Catholic community. And Mary is the only person other than God in the Quran who has an entire section about her. So she was seen as this very honored person, but I imagine her praying, like all Jews, for the coming of the Messiah, not realizing that she was the coming of the Messiah. And not only that, of all the people who have ever lived, that she would in fact be the mother of the Messiah. Just a remarkable thing. And so she conceives Jesus. And when she conceives Jesus, we immediately have a problem. And the problem is Joseph. She is engaged to Joseph. Understand at this time in history, an engagement was a very a strange thing. You could well be engaged to someone before you were born. So like for instance, my parents could see the parents of someone else in town and want to see the properties united or something. So they would agree that one of their children would marry one of my parents' children. And so they would work it out. Usually the firstborn, if they could do it. But they would usually work it out. And so you'd be all set even before you were born. We don't know if that happened with regards to Mary and Joseph, but we do know at the time of the Annunciation, Mary is in fact engaged to Joseph. The idea of sexual relations between two people who are engaged in the Jewish community would be seen as something impolite and undelicate. It would not be seen as a sin as like we would see it. But the fact of the matter is, once you're entered into this relationship, for you to have sexual relations with anyone else is absolutely adultery. That would be forbidden totally. And the issue, of course, is that Mary's pregnant, and Joseph knows he's not the father. So that's the issue. And what happens is Joseph discovers the pregnancy of Mary. We don't know if she told him or whatever. But anyway, he discovers the pregnancy. And it tells us in the scriptures, the verse is, since he was a righteous man and unwilling to put her in shame, he decided to divorce her quietly. See, you could, until you had actually gone through the wedding, you could always go through a divorce as part of the, the engagement. So, and then once the divorce, that would be fine. But Joseph, the divorce would really leave Mary out on a limb, because she is, obviously going to have the child, but it would at least separate Joseph from this. And Joseph was unwilling to do that. And what he wanted to do was have the divorce very quiet, probably have Mary move out of the area or something for a while. In a dream, an angel appears to him. Now remember, Mary, the angel appeared to her, alive and awake. And in Joseph, the angel appears in a dream. Most authors believe, because if you read the Jewish scriptures, the story of Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob, he was called the man of dreams, Joseph, and he had a great gift for interpretation of dreams. It's all through the Genesis story about him. But he had a great gift for this thing of dreams. So anyway, Joseph has the dream, and the angel comes and tells him not to be afraid to take Mary, because the child is conceived through the power of the Holy Spirit. He's also told the name of the child. He's told that the child was to be named Jesus, because he would save people from their sins. And the name Jesus can mean Savior. Okay? And again, this is in Matthew, because it comes from Joseph. Matthew reminds us the key to Matthew's account is it's connected to the prophecies. So Matthew says, this fulfilled what was said through the prophet. A virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and they shall call him Emmanuel. Now they didn't call Jesus Emmanuel, but Jesus was Emmanuel, which is God with us. And Joseph woke up with the angel's message, and he then received Mary into his home. And it says in the text, he had no relations with her before she bore a son and named him Jesus. Many people take this text to mean that Mary and Joseph had sexual relations after the birth of Jesus. That's not contained in the text. There is no text in the Bible that you could use to argue that Mary was a virgin throughout her entire life. And there's no text in the Bible you could use to say that Mary ever had sexual relations with Joseph. The scriptures are only concerned with the fact it's a virgin birth for Jesus. The scriptures are not concerned about the other issue at all, so it isn't covered anywhere. At this point in Luke records Mary's visit to Elizabeth. And as we mentioned, that Elizabeth her child announces to her that, that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. And so Mary and Elizabeth spend some time together. We're told that Mary remained with Elizabeth 3 months. Now remember, Mary conceived Jesus 6 months after John. So for her to stay with Elizabeth 3 months is basically to be there for the birth of John the Baptizer. One thing I like to really point out here is that when God calls us to do things. Oftentimes God calls us to do things that are very difficult. I don't think visiting Elizabeth was too difficult for Mary, but oftentimes God calls us to do something difficult. But we need to remember that everything God asks us to do is for our benefit. It can be for the benefit of all other kinds of people and everything. But I imagine Mary here. Mary will be with Elizabeth at the birth of a child. Now remember, Jesus is going to be Mary's first child. And when Jesus is born, she will be alone in a cave with a carpenter. It is a good thing that Mary has seen the birth of a child before she's in that situation herself. So she's there with Elizabeth, ostensibly to help and to care for Elizabeth, but I would say she's there in God's view to be educated, because she will be alone with Joseph when her child is born. Okay? One of the things that occurs with the birth of John the Baptizer is this canticle where Zachary praises the child and the importance of the child and how holy the child is, and the child is to be the prophet. I'd like you to know that John the Baptizer is the person referred to biblically as the prophet, not a prophet. All the others are a prophet. The prophet was to be the last of the Jewish prophets, and the next thing was the Messiah, and that is John. So he's not just a prophet, he is the prophet. Then we go into the birth of Jesus. And again, all this is Lucan. We're told that there was a census taken, and it's hard for us to identify this. We do know that they took census periodically in the area, and they would do it about 10 or 12 years. The Romans took census because they wanted to know the age of young men for draft. And there was also the idea of collecting taxes and things like this. But the principal thing for the Romans was the army. They were looking for the ages of young men that they could draft. So they would go to areas where their family was from. And Joseph's family is from Bethlehem, the town of David. So Mary and Joseph sent off for Bethlehem. It's interesting when you read this in Luke, because he will tell us that this was when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And over again, Luke will give us names of historical figures who are alive at the time. And for Luke, this is written as a history. He deals with it as a history. If I were to ask Matthew when Jesus was born, he would say at the time the prophecies were fulfilled. If I were to ask Luke when Jesus was born, he'd give me a date. So they're very different ways of looking at it. When we put together the different names that Luke gives us and know when those people lived and ruled and did whatever they did, we know that the birth of Jesus took place almost exactly on the year 4 BC. That would be exactly the year. Why is it different? Because we think history begins with the birth of Jesus. Why is it different? It's different because they used a different calendar. We used what's called the Gregorian calendar, and that did not come into use till later. And when it came into use, you know, the idea of leap year and stuff like that, when that came into use, they had lost 4 years. And so that's kind of how that worked. So they went off and they arrive in Bethlehem. We're told that when they're there are shepherds living in the region. If you visit Israel today, you find that this area, there's the city of Bethlehem, and then there's an area of fields that are between Bethlehem and Jerusalem. It's 7 miles. It's an easy walk, actually. But these fields are where they raise sheep. And in Jesus' day, they were the sheep that were raised for sacrifice in the temple. Those lands belonged to the high priest. And so they raised the animals there for sacrifice. That's one of the reasons why angels will come and announce to the shepherds about the birth of Jesus, because Jesus is the last one to be sacrificed. He is the Lamb of God, and he will be the last Lamb of sacrifice. So it's important the shepherds are told. So the shepherds then go up to Bethlehem, and when they get there, we have this singing of the angels, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among people of good will. The thing to know about this is that it is a custom in Judaism that when there is a firstborn male in a family, people in the town will come and serenade the mother. And one of the reasons is this is a sign that name will continue in Israel. That name will not be lost. So it's a big deal, because God had Mary and Joseph move to Bethlehem for this, where they don't know anybody. God provided the choir. The angels came, so they had the singing for the birth. And the shepherds came and saw Jesus as well. Luke goes on to record the circumcision of Jesus, and I think mainly the reason he tells us about the circumcision of Jesus, which we would know would happen with any Jewish baby, is he wants to remind us of the name, that the name that was given to Joseph at the time of Joseph's dream is the name that Jesus receives. At his circumcision, he's named Jesus. Luke then tells us about a presentation in the temple, and there are two things that are going on that Luke sort of confuses. The Lucan account was most probably written in Damascus, and the author of the account is most probably not Jewish. And so there's an unfamiliarity with the customs. When a child was born, there were two things that had to take place. First of all, the woman had to go to the temple. And she had to go to the temple after a certain period of time and make a sacrifice. And the sacrifice was one of the things that renders you unclean is in fact any flow of blood. So if you're injured, cut yourself or something, you have to wait a certain length of time, go to the temple, and make a sacrifice in thanksgiving for the cleansing. And so that has to be done by a woman who has a child. The second thing is, in the case of a firstborn male, if you remember during their stay in Egypt, when they left Egypt, the firstborn male of everyone, even Pharaoh, died. But the firstborn of the Jews did not die. So they considered the firstborn as belonging uniquely to God. And so what you had to do with a firstborn child at one time, at Jesus' time it's a firstborn male, but originally it was just a firstborn child. You take the firstborn male and you present the male to the priest. And then you make a sacrifice and get the child back, because the child belongs. You didn't have to make the sacrifice and take the child back. And in the case of John the Baptizer, it appears as though he was raised in the temple. In the case of Samuel in the Jewish scriptures, he was raised in the temple. You had to give the child, but normally you would ransom him and have him back. I always like to point out with people that that only applies to the firstborn child, because the second you'd know enough probably to leave the child in the temple. But with the first one, you'll take the child. So Mary then, we have the presentation, and Luke tells us that they presented the child, and they take a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. A rich person would always redeem the child with a lamb. A poor person would use doves. It's probably the 2 doves. Luke has mixed the 2 things that take place. One's a sacrifice for Jesus, and the other would be the sacrifice for Mary for the purification. And those would not take place on the same day. In Jerusalem, we're told, again by Luke, there was a man by the name of Simeon. He was righteous, a good man, and he was awaiting the coming of the Messiah. And he'd had an inspiration from God that he would not die until he had seen the Messiah. So he was waiting. The last prophecy of the Messiah is in, I think it's in Malachi, and it says that the Messiah will appear suddenly in the temple. So Simeon knows the Messiah has to appear there in the temple, so he's there. When they give the child, Simeon sees the child and knew by the inspiration of the Spirit that this, in fact, was the Messiah. And Simeon takes the child into his arms and he begins a prayer. Incidentally, this is the night prayer said by priests at the end of the office every day. He says, "Now, Master, let your servant go in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you prepared in the sight of all the people, a light of revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel." You notice he mentions Gentiles before Israel. That's a sign of Luke, too. Luke normally will mention Gentiles before Israel. The other accounts would do the reverse. The thing that is powerful about this is that what is Simeon holding? Simeon's holding a baby, 10 days old, something like that. I forget the exact date. There is an exact date, though. But he's holding the baby, and that's all he's holding. As far as he's concerned, he's seen the fulfillment of everything that God has promised, and he knows the child he's holding will redeem Israel and the entire world. He knows that through faith. In holding this child, he accepts it's all accomplished. You know, I oftentimes think we don't understand that because we're little tiny babies when we're baptized. But you know, when the water of baptism is poured over you, the prayers say it's all accomplished. Where I noticed it the first time was when I went to communion. You know, we're told very clearly, eat my body, drink my blood, you'll live forever. So the first time the Eucharist is put in our hands, it's really accomplished. But we can't accept accomplishment unless we see the whole thing through for some reason. But anyway, it says the mother and father were amazed by this. And Simeon then turned to Mary and said that Jesus would be destined for the fall and rise of many in Israel. I'd like you to know it's more comfortable to say in Hebrew or Aramaic to say fall and rise. That's the way, rise and fall rather. We always speak of rise and fall. But Jesus is not destined for the rise and fall of anyone, but for the fall, which is sin, and the rise of everyone. So he states it that way. And he says, and you yourself a sword will pierce, so that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. There are a lot of different interpretations of that. The one I like comes from St. Augustine. And St. Augustine says that up till the days of Jesus, people always thought that things went very well for holy people and things went bad for people who were less than holy. But what Mary reveals to us, Mary is the only human being outside of Jesus who is God as well. But Mary is the only human being we see in the scriptures without any sin at all. And she had a very, very difficult life. And I think that's what meant that with the person of Mary, this idea that everything goes well for good people ended. It simply ended as an idea there. Then we find a prophetess. Her name's Anna. And we don't know much about anything she says. We're just told that she also spoke. And that would be true to Luke. It's very important to Luke that women are given equal roles with men. Women are very important in Luke. So Luke has this Anna speak. The next thing appears in Matthew. It's the story of the Magi. And the Magi were priests. And they lived in Persia, and the duty of the Magi was to study the stars. They were astrologers, and they would study the stars and predict events and that sort of thing. They had a very set system they did. And the leader of the country, and he was called a satrap, but the leader of the country could not make a decision without consulting the Magi. He didn't have to do what they said, but he had to consult them. So the Magi were very important. Now, what they did, they had a grid they applied to the sky. Let me just use one example. They had a grid they applied to the sky, and if they saw a shooting star, the grid would refer to countries, and they could tell you where that person was born and where they would be manifested, by where the shooting star started and where it stopped. And so they could say that from seeing this thing. That would be any important person, okay? Then they would take and apply the grid itself to a single country, and that would indicate where they were supposed to go. And so we'll notice the Magi are following a star, and normally we think of like a star on a string in front of the Magi being led. But the Magi followed the stars and had ways of reading them, which is what, in this case, would lead them to Jesus. Another reason to know they're from Persia is the gifts they bring. They bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold is valuable anywhere. Frankincense is very, very expensive outside of Persia. Frankincense is actually a yellow-colored sap. Looks much like the sap from a pine tree. And myrrh is a brick red sap. They're both out of trees that grow in the Persia area. And if you lived in Persia, you could have one of those trees in your yard and use it all the time. But as the further you got away from Persia, the more valuable that became. So when you get to Israel, gold, frankincense, and myrrh are all very valuable. But for the Catholic tradition, what we've seen in the gifts, gold was a symbol of kings. I think you know at certain times in history, only kings could own gold. When I was a little boy, it was against the law for anyone in the United States to own gold. You had to turn in the government and take our money, which was backed by gold legally. Now the government wasn't upset about people having jewelry and rings and stuff, but you couldn't buy blocks of gold and stuff like that. That was all against the law. So gold is a symbol of the, if you want to call the political authority of Jesus. Frankincense, under Jewish law, there's a death penalty to burn frankincense in a home. Frankincense is only for God. And in the Catholic Church, that's a symbol of the divinity of Jesus. And myrrh, this sap, would be heated up till it was a liquid, and was one of the primary ingredients in coating the bodies to seal mummies. So it's basically an embalming thing. And for us, embalming represents death, and that's the humanity of Jesus. Jesus is God, frankincense. Jesus is a human being, myrrh, he'll die. And Jesus is simultaneously Lord of everything, symbolized by the gold. So that goes on. We're told that Herod was really trying to find the Messiah once he found out from the Magi that the Messiah had been born. Herod, when we study him historically, was probably one of the most paranoid people who ever lived. And he killed all kinds of people around him. There was a joke among the Romans in Rome itself where they said it would be better to be Herod's pig than to be his friend, because he would never kill a pig as a Jew. He would not kill a pig. But he killed his wives, he killed his children, everyone. So if he knew that there was someone important born, he was going to end their life. The scriptures record that he went into the city of Bethlehem and murdered all the children under the age of 2, which tells you how long it is between when the Magi first saw the star and when they got to Bethlehem. So Jesus was 2 years old when Mary and Joseph received the message again. Joseph received the message in the dream that they were to go to Egypt. And so they fled to Egypt. The reason you'd go to Egypt at that time historically we're just talking flat out desert. But you would know you were out of the authority of Herod as soon as you saw the pyramids. And there's an area right around Cairo that is an ancient Jewish section. It dates way before Jesus as a Jewish section there around that area of Cairo. And incidentally, it's called at that time Babylon, and not the famous Babylon, but this was founded by Jews when Jerusalem was destroyed. And so the Jews that did not escape went to Babylon as slaves. And those who escaped went to what is basically Cairo, and they called it Babylon though, because they had escaped having to go to Babylon. So Mary and Joseph go there, and the children are killed. There's no reference anywhere to the killing of the children in contemporary literature that we have yet found. But the fact of the matter is, allowing for the personality of Herod, allowing for the size of the village, and probably the small number of children, this wouldn't even merit a footnote in what was going on at that time in history. So it's no big deal that it is not mentioned. After a while, the death of Herod, the angel will come to Mary and to Joseph, and will speak to Joseph in the dream, and they're to go back. They decide not to stay in Bethlehem, but they go on to Nazareth, and they stay there, and they go to Galilee. Again, for Matthew, this is the fulfillment of a prophecy that Jesus would be known as a Nazarene. So they moved to Nazareth. I should tell you that there is no prophecy that Jesus would be a Nazarene, even though Matthew quotes it as a prophecy. What we do know is there was a vow that people used to take, which was called a Nazarite vow. And the Nazarite vow, you wouldn't touch alcohol, and you would let your hair grow. Samson was under the Nazarite vow. He lost his strength because he broke the vow when his hair was cut. John the Baptizer was under the Nazarite vow. So was Samuel, and so was John the Baptizer. That they accepted that vow on themselves. And this came to mean, a Nazarite came to mean a holy person. And we know the Messiah was to be a holy person. So that's probably how Matthew sort of put it together. So they get back to their town. The only other story we have is the visit to Jerusalem. As soon as Jesus is 12 years old, he's officially a Jew, like bar mitzvah. And he comes under the obligations. And depending how far you lived from Jerusalem, you had to be in Jerusalem for certain of the feasts. So in Bethlehem, I think the only one you really needed to be in Jerusalem for was Passover. So Jesus goes with the family. And when they get to Jerusalem, they find out that Jesus is missing. Rather, after they go to Jerusalem, they go home and they find that Jesus is missing. Now, it would not be unusual because children under the age of 12 would travel with the women, and children over the age of 12, boys over the age of 12, would travel with the men. And the men and women traveled separately at that time, largely because of visiting. It's one of the few times when they would get together. Men tended to gather at work. Women tended to gather around the well in the town. But it was their one time to gather that way, because most of their time really was spent working. So anyway, they discover Jesus is not with them. They go back to the temple. And while they're looking around, they found him in the temple. I'd like to do the reading. It says, after 3 days, they found him in the temple. Those 3 days remind us, or are prophetic of the resurrection. He was in the midst of the teachers, listening and asking questions. And everyone who heard him was astounded at his understanding and his answers. I'd like you to kind of know what's going on here. When they went to Jerusalem for Passover, all the rabbis would go with their communities, but the rabbis would gather in little groups and discuss what they were interested in. So if this rabbi was interested in the prophecies of the Messiah, he'd go into a group with other rabbis that would ask about that. Some rabbis are interested in kosher law. And I think, Jews and these things love to discuss and go on about this. So there'd be all little tiny groups around Jerusalem, and you would go listen to the group you wanted to. Usually, like for instance, if your rabbi was interested in kosher law, you'd go listen to something else. You'd head it up to here with kosher law or with prophecy. Whatever your rabbi was about, you'd heard plenty of. So you would go to one of the others. Well, imagine Jesus as a little boy. He goes in, he's 12 years old, and he raises his hand to ask a question. Everyone there would immediately realize this was a little boy exercising his Jewishness. He had the right to be there now, 12 years old. And so everything would stop. We'd look at this cute little boy. And little boy would stand up and he'd say, I'm curious. It's always been confusing that the Messiah was supposed to be a king and the Messiah was supposed to be a priest. And the kings come from the royal family and the priests come from the priestly family. Would this prophecy be fulfilled if the father came from the kingly family and the mother came from the priestly family? The rabbis would all, yes. No one had ever suggested that as a solution. Families normally didn't intermarry. So no one had suggested that as a solution. And no one would have known Jesus was talking about himself. And, you look at different things about, we're told in the scriptures that he would be from Nazareth. And we're also told in the scriptures he would be born in Bethlehem. Well, would that be fulfilled if he was born in Bethlehem but raised in Nazareth? Well, yes, it would. But no one had ever suggested that. People didn't travel around that much, particularly not children who were raised in a town. And I believe at this moment, Jesus knows he's the Messiah. But I think he found it out from that gathering with those questions. And all he did was ask questions, but he awed them by the questions he asked. And the wisdom of Jesus is shown there. And so Mary says that, why have you done this to us? I think it's really wonderful. Anything that ever happens that someone does that isn't particularly what I want, I presume they did it against me. That's kind of the way we think as human beings. And Jesus said, did you not know I must be in my Father's house? And that's a response to, did you not know your Father and I were looking for you? Jesus here takes the word Father and applies it to God. He takes it away from Joseph and gives it to God. He will always honor Joseph as his father as we go on and everything, but he wants to clearly understand that God is his Father. And once that's been said, then it says he goes home and is obedient to them. His mother held all these things in her heart. Luke adds that several times in his account. He's trying to tell you Mary remembered it and said it accurately when he got it. And it says Jesus advanced in wisdom, age, and favor before God and man. And what we see now in Jesus is this advance, but it begins at this moment where these little pieces that he has had, he's able to put together, and he discovers he is in fact the fulfillment of the prophecies. After that, in the scriptures in all four accounts, we immediately go to the visit to John the Baptizer and the beginning of the public ministry of Jesus, where he will meet his apostles and they'll all come together there. Thank you very much.